I want to give you a good example of what a good, average, typical, high-end running back one looks like from the recent era of draft classes, just to give you an idea of what you're looking at. Because I know not everyone spends all the time looking at stats, and I can say 2.7 adjusted yards per team attempt, and you're like, cool, that's a number. Is that good or not? And me occasionally referencing what the average does probably does it a little bit better, but I thought just giving you an example of a solid, no one really had many questions, running back profile looks like, so you have some level of context, right? So let's talk about Jonathan Taylor. Yeah, so Jonathan Taylor's rookie running back profile looked like this. You see that he played from the ages of 18 to 20 years old. He had no games missed, really, playing 14, 13, and then 14 games through the first 3 years of his career. You can see that his rushing dominator, a stat someone recently asked me to add in. It's not a great stat, but it's a good descriptive stat of what they were doing. Ranges from around 57 to 79%. The average rookie running back to have at least 2 top 12 seasons, I think their best season rushing dominator is around 67%. So you can see Jonathan Taylor clearly cleared that hurdle in the last season and ultimately destroyed it. And again, rushing dominator isn't the strongest stat in the world, but it does display exactly how much of the overall volume he was co-opting in that final year. You can see he had 37% of opportunities through the rushing game and the receiving game, and he ranges from 48% to 56% of the team's overall rushing opportunities, and it's just green lights across the board in terms of his overall volume. If we look across, we can see he was involved in the receiving game. Now, you can look at this a variety of different ways. Zach Reed from the Dynatsy Dummies likes to use something I call the Zach Reed rule, which is just did they catch 20 passes or more throughout 2 or more college seasons, and that's a good receiving back. Any threshold you draw like that is going to ultimately be arbitrary. You just, especially with statistics, looking for good, consistent involvement in the receiving game. We do have better stats now to show how dynamic or how much they were targeted in terms of their overall usage. It does give us an insight to whether they're just being used in the receiving game or if they're an active weapon in the receiving game at the running back position. Jonathan Taylor is kind of a midpoint on that, which is also why I thought he'd work as a good example of like a solid, clear running back one profile. Routes per game is actually a really interesting stat I've been looking at a lot. Running backs with 2 top 12 seasons average around 5 routes a game, which is almost nothing. A running back with a full workload easily gets 10 routes a game, in fact, slightly over that. You can see Jonathan Taylor wasn't exactly a stud in that, but he did get 4, 5, and then 8 routes per game overall. So Jonathan Taylor is clearly used in the receiving game. His targets per route run is excessively high, so when he was on the field to get a target, he got a target by and large. So you see he's not running active routes. He's not a route runner necessarily, but he is an active part of the receiving game. Now, the one I really like to look at, which is my main running back stat, is actually adjusted yards per team attempt. Their best model or points per game season tends to run around 2.3. Now, you've got a lot of players with below average profiles that are kind of dragging that down a little bit, but 2.3 is a fine, good number for measuring how much of the total offensive production that this running back was co-opting from that team or created for that team, especially because adjusted yards per team attempt doubles up their receiving work. So it's giving extra yards to a player that's getting more yards in the receiving game, because receiving is so important when it comes to fantasy points, especially in PPR leagues, which most are these days. 2 other stats I reference quite a lot, elusive rating and yards after contact per attempt per game? Yeah, I think PFF does that per game. Now, the average running back with 2 top 12 seasons gets around a 97 elusiveness rating in their best season. You can see that Jonathan Taylor, with a full workload every year, because we sometimes talk about performance stats relative to how much you are touching the ball, how much opportunity you got, because the lower the opportunity you get, the more likely you are to have excessive or high levels of performance stats. Mainly because you're on the field to be used, but also because it's easier to look efficient or to look good on a smaller amount of touches. Run it back another 10 times and we'll see if that average sustains, and then you know if that player is actually performing at that level. With running back stats, it's particularly difficult because the length of time you really need to see a running back in a performance stat tends to be lifelong rather than 2 or 3 seasons or 8 games or something we can actively rely on. But elusiveness rating seems to be fairly stable, so does yards after contact per attempt. So it's a pretty good number to use. I've ultimately concluded these are my 2 favorite numbers from PFF for the running back position. Jonathan Taylor is clearly above the average in 2 years with a full volume workload in his first and his final year. The average yards per contact after attempt for a running back with 2 top 12 season is around 3.5, I want to say. I'm going to check that. Is around 3.7. Jonathan Taylor never dipped below 3.7 yards after contact per attempt. Now from there you can dip into other things. What's their offensive line look like? What's the situation they were coming from? Are they running through just megalithic holes on every play? Darrell Henderson suffered from that, I was told after the fact. We don't know exactly how to adjust some of these stats for that context, but there's always good to add more context, which is why I'm always willing to listen to more information about more players. And there's a lot more stats we can look at. We can look at all of these stats in relation to their conference's average and their team's average and stuff like that. But generally, that's a good idea of what a really good top-level running back 1 profile looks like. Excessively elusive, according to PFF, with a full volume workload, hitting plenty of yards after they're contacted, at least 3.7, after they're contacted when they have that volume, and that's important when it comes down to a stat like that. And overall, just dominance in touches, especially at the rushing position, but it's nice to see some targets. Jonathan Taylor didn't have amazing receiving stats, but he certainly had solid stats, and that's another reason I thought he'd make a good quintessential example, because he's recently entered the NFL. He was a clear running back 1 across ADP, and pretty much everyone who doesn't admit it now. Anyone who didn't have his running back 1 probably doesn't admit it right now. And even he had some slight warts, like what was that receiving about, you know? But still, that's what a running back 1 profile looks like in a vacuum. There are really no huge questions here. So thanks very much, and I will see you again in the next video.